I suppose I've always been a horror fanatic since I was a little kid. And then when I was much older, saw a book about Guignol and realised there was a specialised horror theatre. And this was a great revelation, to actually realise there was a horror theatre that was extremely significant within French culture. The Teatru du Guignol, the Guignol Theatre, opened in Paris in 1897. It was a very small theatre that was in a deconsecrated chapel. And interesting enough, they still left some of the church ornaments inside, like these 12-foot angels that were carved. Angels. Yeah, and the smell of incense from its days as a Catholic chapel could still be smelt there, and so that created a kind of the atmosphere for this theatre. Now, the reason it opened first of all was simply to be an experiment in naturalist drama.
The Guignol itself is from many traditions. It originated from extreme naturalism or morbid naturalism to show the lives of underclass people, of pimps and prostitutes and desperate people, and how they lived and so forth.
But quite soon they discovered a kind of niche for themselves, and this was the niche of horror. They found they did one particular play, or a series of plays actually, that kind of captured the atmosphere of horror. So it was less a kind of slice of life than a slice of death. And it had such an impact. Audiences were coming to see those plays that they realised here was a great marketing possibility. And thus the Guignol, as we understand it, was born.
Sweeney Todd itself was a classic 19th century melodrama. We've got clear-cut villains and heroes, you've got victims, you've got everything that you want in the melodrama. So audiences would lap that up. Now, melodrama was popular throughout Europe. It was very popular throughout England. It was also very popular in France. In Paris, there was the very famous Boulevard du Crime, the Boulevard of Crime, where the Blood and Thunder melodrama houses were all lined up. And that was also in Montmartre, the same broad area in which the Guignol was located.
For me, Sweeney Todd, it comes from lots of different traditions. Dark Broadway musicals. There was certainly for a long time this theater within the theater of the mocking Urzet's qualities or camp ideas inside melodrama. But then there was pure Guignol, which I think Stephen Sondheim was always interested in. One aspect that separates the melodrama and the Guignol is the melodrama has to end happily. The melodrama has to work with a certain narrative quality and have certain kinds of characters, where Guignol tended to borrow from life and tended not to have this moralistic ending. In this sense, it certainly follows Sweeney Todd. And the lyricism inside the musical is a kind of lyricism that echoes Guignol sensibilities more than melodramatic ones.
Also, I think it's the way Guignol works in terms of the structure of it, that we may not, the villain may not get their comeuppance during the time of the play. Who knows what will happen after the curtain's gone down, where the story continues. But what you do identify as the victim. You know that person, when they sit in the barber seat, will get their jugular cut at some point. You're not sure when. There'll be a build-up to that moment. And actually in Guignol, that's where the story would end. The cutting of the jugular and the curtain would go down. Whereas with Sweeney Todd, it's a broader exploration of that story.
And he's always going
justice.
to end up swinging from his gibbet on Tyburn. Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
One of the interesting things, the surprises that scholars are always looking for when they do deep research, one of the surprises for me was the great influence of the Guignol in Hollywood. And the Guignol certainly, by the early sound era, had its own styles of presentation that were both realistic and totally stylized. And if you look at Bela Lugosi, if you look at Boris Karloff, if you look at Lon Chaney, and many of the influences of people like Todd Browning, the director, come directly from Guignol, where it has aspects of something magical and cartoonish mixed in with something morbidly natural.
Some of the non-monster movies of those days were really the main character had sort of a psychological flaw, or the haunted house as motivated by some unscrupulous person. Those were themes that were very common Grand Guignol themes.
The term Grand Guignol, the Guignol is a Punch and Judy show in France, or the equivalent of our Punch and Judy show. So a Grand Guignol is literally Punch and Judy for adults. Now what they were saying by that is not that you're going to go and see a puppet show, but this is in line with the kind of radical naturalism that informed the opening of the Grand Guignol, was the idea of humans being manipulated within society. So it was a kind of a radical experiment.
It was a theater that was based on taboos, which is what art is really about. What happens when you violate a taboo? And the Grand Guignol had boiled down these taboos to sex and violence. How much of the body can be mutilated? Can we still survive? What is valid for vengeance? And mostly the Grand Guignol had certain themes. One was it had this dark humor about how to think about existence and about social institutions. And it began to ask a question and to set up scenarios about how any one of us can do something crazy and violent and wild and taboo breaking under the right circumstances.
It's really things that are more realistic and scary. People going mad. Madness had a lot to do. A lot of the plays took places in madhouses, or people slowly going crazy and not realizing why. Insanity was a big aspect of it, because that's more terrifying, I think, to the human psyche, because you're vulnerable to that. Anybody could just kind of snap at any one given moment.
The hair of the shop assistant. The eyes. Don't touch her! The heart. Murdered the gal.
The shows alternate between terror plays and comedies. The terror plays being like cold showers, they would call them, and the sex farces, hot showers. So the combination was called the douche écossais, or the Scottish shower, this kind of roller coaster of dread and terror and pure titillation.
All I know that is in exchange for your lovely little body, my dear, our friend Brockau will continue to enrich my gallery of curiosity. Bastard! What?
Tonight we're performing Shocktoberfest 2007, Maker of Monsters. We're in San Francisco in the South of Market District, which is kind of the seedy club and S&M district of San Francisco, not unlike where the original Le Teatru de Grand Guignol was. We're in a 46-seat theater called the Hypnodrome, and Thrill Peddlers, the company I produce for, has been around for 17 years now. And having our own space has given us the ability to really expand on what our vision for producing Grand Guignol plays is. What we're seeing tonight is a recreation or a recreation through Thrill Peddlers' filter of Grand Guignol evening.
Most people who like to see recreations or revivals are of a certain type, but here, coming into the small theater, the Grand Guignol, they were interested in this liveliness of sex and violence, the way the original Grand Guignolers were in Paris. So, and even the French cultural attaché was supportive and thought that it was interesting that it was in America where there was this revival of their Grand Guignol was flourishing and developing audiences.
Very delicate operation. The effect is achieved by removing the dog's bill completely. Then, remove the cerebellum, only very slowly, bit by bit. However, without killing it, just enough to drive it completely insane. That's wretched. No more so than foie gras. Foie gras!
We do this because we love the theater, not because we're horror movie fans looking to recreate a horror movie, but because we believe in what the theater can do and how it can connect to an audience. And a lot of people have forgotten that theater can be about horror, that theater can be about terror and such extremes. And we like to bring that back to remind people that yes, theater does this well too.
Both the guillotine and the cephalic vivarium, a machine that will keep a severed human head alive, have their origins for us in Grand Guignol plays, but the plays that we wrote around them were almost entirely new. Grand Guignol's hallmark certainly is the blood and gore, but it's just a fraction of what goes on stage during an evening of Grand Guignol.
To experience it with real live actors and real effects that seem eerily real, that your brain keeps telling you that no, it's fake blood, it's a fake eyeball, it's a fake earlobe, the hand is not really being sawed off, but another part of your brain is saying it could be real.
Both the original theater and here, oftentimes you'll find that it's a half-hour play that leads up to the bloodletting. And thematically, what is leading up to it is not just the suspense that something awful is going to happen, but many times a Grand Guignol play will tell you first what's going to happen, and then the audience is on the edge of their seat saying, how are they going to do this? So there's a play that we've done several times. It was called The Old Women rather, when they did it in London first, and it was translates to A Crime in the Madhouse.
There's a scene in Crime in the Madhouse where there's a sane woman who has to spend one more night in a mental asylum, and it's Christmas and everyone is ignoring her and the staff, where the three crazy women decide that she has a cuckoo behind her beautiful eyes. And they want to release the cuckoos. So one of the women takes a fork, breaks into her room, and jabs the fork into her eye socket and scoops out her eye.
What you get in the French version that you don't get in the English version is once the madwomen discover that no cuckoo bird has flown out of Louise's head, which was the ploy for gouging out this poor girl's eyes, the two old women turn on one eye and they bash her head against a cast iron stove and kill her. And that's a good effect too, because they burn her face real good first.
My great-grandfather, Charles Nanon, was the last director of the Grand Guignol Theater in Paris. He was the director up until 1962 when it finally closed down. He was a director twice for a total of, I believe, 26 years. My grandmother has remarked, as I was growing up, multiple times, that growing up in that theater and in the environment, my great-grandfather would have red stage blood caked under his fingernails almost all the time. He was renowned for mixing 7 different shades of blood. Different types of wounds called for different types of blood, and he was very adamant about that. And to my knowledge, he never gave out his recipe for blood to anyone. That was the big stage secret. It was very visceral at the time, everything from eyes being gouged out, and them using actually real cow eyes or pig eyes or glass eyes, to heads being removed, all sorts of torture, things to really make people, squirm.
No trip to Paris was ever complete without a visit to the Grand Guignol. You had a curious sort of mixture of audiences. You had the regular people who lived around Montmartre in the seedy red light district who kind of claimed the Grand Guignol as their own. But you also got visiting dignitaries and businessmen, even royalty, attending the Grand Guignol as well. So it was quite a mixed audience that were coming into this, what was the smallest theatre in Paris. An evening at the Grand Guignol doesn't start at the theatre. An evening at the Grand Guignol starts at least as you emerge from the metro station at Pigalle. It's the nearest metro station to the bright lights of the red light district. You then have about a half-mile walk down a quiet street that is lined by much quieter, seedier strip joints and brothels until you finally arrive at the theatre. And the small alleyway at the end, which the theatre was, kind of emerges on you all of a sudden. And it's suddenly it's a very quiet area. So you go from the big bright lights and noise of the central red light district Place de Pigalle, right the way to a very quiet, eerie, dark corner of the district.
And also, it's not the kind of place you stumble across. You go there with a purpose. And when you turn that corner down that little cobblestoned alleyway, you know where you are, you know what you're going to see.
The auditorium itself is a small auditorium. More importantly than that, it was an intimate auditorium. It was wider than it was longer, so no matter where you were pretty much close to the stage. In fact, there was an old joke that if you sat on the front row, you could shake hands with the actors on stage. But what it also had was what were called les boîtes, which were the sort of boxes, private boxes at the back of the theatre, where you could take your young lady to have a private viewing of the play, undisturbed by other audience members, and it was the last theatre in Paris to retain these particular boxes. So it was quite a special theatre, and of course, as Richard mentioned earlier, the auditorium had carved angels from its old days as a chapel, still there to add to the spookiness and the atmosphere of the place.
My great-grandfather, was there at the very end, and he had a quote, "We could never match the horrors of Buchenwald." At the time, post-World War II, Paris, people weren't really in the mindset to go see, people being eviscerated on stage.
What is clear is that the Grand Guignol didn't just close in 1962. It had been in decline for a good 17 years before that, and it lasted as long as it did. The Grand Guignol very definitely happened to the interwar period, and before that to the Belle Epoque. It no longer had a place in the modern post-war world. It was just out of step with the times.
You find in contemporary horror is increasingly there's been a move towards real or possible horrors, and that's the very spirit of the Grand Guignol. There's not so many films about Dracula, Frankenstein, the kind of fantastical monsters. That's a slightly different tradition, but films like the Saw trilogy, Hostel, numerous films like that, they have fantastic Grand Guignol set pieces, a lot of suspense, a lot of build-up, a lot of anticipation. But it's very clearly in that tradition of Grand Guignol theatre.
In the Grand Guignol, one of the most important aspects is how humor and extreme violence are balanced, and how they work with and against audience expectation. And one of the beauties, for me, of Sweeney Todd is exactly that. It works against audience expectation and keeps turning and churning in ways that you wouldn't expect from a musical.
I think also the other important thing with Sweeney Todd in relation to Grand Guignol is that mixture of horror and laughter. There's moments of real thrills, jumps, those moments, those gruesome moments, but there's also delightful moments of humour, maybe very dark humour, very sardonic humour, but it's humour nonetheless.